Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we are cracking open a seriously chilling piece of source material called The Permanent Portrait of the House of No Return. And listen, we aren't just reading another campfire ghost story today. We're really going to break down the anatomy of a legend to see exactly how it traps its victims. So, let's jump right into it. So, let's kick things off with a pretty fundamental question, right? One that really drives this entire narrative. What actually happens when you just ignore decades of warnings? It's a fascinating look at the psychology behind human curiosity. The text immediately forces us to ask ourselves why someone would deliberately cross a clearly established boundary. I mean, we've all seen warnings, whether it's a barbed wire keep-out sign or a local myth that absolutely everyone in town swears by. But there is always that fatal mistake, that little voice in our heads believing we're somehow the exception to the rule. And that psychological hook, that is exactly where our source material begins. 50 years. Think about that for a second. The text establishes right out of the gate that the house on the hill didn't just get a bad reputation last Halloween. It stood completely abandoned for over 50 years. We're talking about a structure with rotting walls, totally busted windows, and a rusted gate that has literally sat untouched for half a century. 50 years of locals actively avoiding a piece of property means the danger isn't just a passing rumor. It is a deeply ingrained generational fear. And over those 5 decades, a very specific and, frankly, terrifying folklore took root. The locals gave the property an incredibly ominous title, the House of No Return. The text objectively details the terrifying rumors that earned it this name. People whispered that they could actually hear screams echoing from the property at night. They claimed to see shadows darting around behind those broken windows. And most importantly, the absolute core of the myth, anyone who actually steps foot inside simply vanishes forever. The text sets this up not as some spooky story, but as an undeniable, cold, hard local truth. All right, enter our subject, a curious 22-year-old guy named Ethan who decides he is going to be the one to breach those rusted gates. And get this, his investigation gear is astonishingly minimal. A flashlight, a camera, and, as the text explicitly points out, enough courage to ignore every single warning we were just talking about. He's armed with nothing but illumination, documentation, and pure hubris. Though, let's be real, a backup battery would have probably been smarter, but it's a classic setup, right? The modern, highly rational young investigator trying to shine a literal and figurative light on an old, irrational superstition. The pacing in the source text here is just wild. It documents this incredibly rapid escalation of sensory details. Minute 1, Ethan steps inside and, boom, the front door immediately slams shut behind him. He rationalizes this as the wind, because of course he does. But by minute 3, the environment itself reacts. The air turns unnaturally cold, and his flashlight, his one single source of safety, begins to flicker. By minute 5, the illusion of isolation is broken. He hears slow, heavy footsteps pacing upstairs in a supposedly empty house. And finally, at minute 6, the footsteps completely cease, only to be replaced by a voice way too close to him, whispering a single word: leave. It's an absolute masterclass in building tension. Now, any normal person would be sprinting for the hills, right? Not Ethan. Instead of leaving, his curiosity actually pushes him forward, leading us to this crucial scene. A door at the far end of the hallway opens completely by itself. Inside, the text describes a really stark, dusty room. There's no giant monster waiting to jump out, just a single old wooden chair sitting right in the center of the room. And resting on that chair is a photograph. This deliberate minimalism is brilliant because it forces Ethan and us as the audience to zero in on that single object. It shifts the horror from the surrounding environment to something deeply, intimately personal. Finding that photo triggers a fundamental shift in the source material, forcing this massive contrast between two diverging realities. On one hand, there's the physical reality of the decaying house, empty, with broken windows and rotting walls that have sat untouched for 50 years. But then there's this supernatural reality Ethan is suddenly thrust into, where the architecture itself starts shifting and the house becomes an active, hostile entity. The physical decay was just a shell hiding a deeply psychological trap. Okay, so here is how the trap mechanically triggers its climax. First, Ethan realizes the photograph actually shows the missing people, and to his absolute horror, a new face is slowly forming on the paper as if drawn by invisible hands, and it's his own face. Panic sets in. He tries to run for the stairs, but the hallway literally elongates, stretching out like a treadmill to cut off his escape. The architecture is actively working against him. Then comes the physical assault. Every single door in the hallway bursts open at once with a deafening bang. The lights die entirely, leaving him totally surrounded by dozens of pale, lifeless, shadowy figures. The trap has officially sprung. And man, the text uses auditory horror just as effectively as the visual horror here. Remember that quiet little "leave" whisper from earlier? Yeah, that transforms completely. As the doors bang open, voices start echoing from every single direction. The first command is stay. It's no longer telling him to get out. The house has him exactly where it wants him. This is immediately followed up by a relentless barrage of overlapping voices chanting, "You belong here." Look at how the text builds that intense psychological pressure. The house isn't just physically trapping him, it is psychologically breaking him down, actively forcing a new identity onto him. It's basically telling the investigator that he's no longer an observer. He is now a permanent resident of the myth itself. And then, the final piece of this auditory assault hits. You can never leave. After dropping his flickering flashlight, the sudden pitch-black darkness allows these pale figures of past victims to completely encircle him. And the creepy part? They don't attack him. Instead, these overlapping, relentless voices echo all around him as the lifeless figures slowly point in one unified direction, guiding him straight toward the basement. So what does he do? This forces Ethan into a descent into the basement. What's truly fascinating here is that the text notes he moves against every single survival instinct he has. The psychological breaking down actually worked. Guided by the shadows of the missing people, he walks toward that creaking basement door. He's no longer investigating out of curiosity. He is being herded down into the depths of the house to uncover the absolute core truth of the legend. And down there in the dark, pouring through old dusty journals, Ethan finally discovers that truth. The backstory he finds confirms the horrific reality behind the town's lore. The house was once owned by a wealthy family, but after a tragic accident, every single member just vanished. Turns out, the local belief was spot on. Their spirits remained trapped inside the structure. And the mechanism of this curse is just simple and brutal. The spirits are lonely, or maybe just vindictive, and they trap anyone who enters the house to stay with them forever. So the legend isn't just a scary story, it's practically a historical record of a localized supernatural quarantine. For Ethan's final moments of awareness, the text relies heavily on these super vivid sensory descriptions. Before he can even attempt to process this new knowledge or try to escape, a tall, dark shadow appears directly behind him, just watching. The temperature, which was already unnaturally cold, just plummets. It drops so drastically that his breath turns white in the air as this massive shadow inches closer and closer. And then, total sensory deprivation. Everything goes completely black. From there, the text shifts its tone entirely for the aftermath, giving us nothing but the cold, hard facts. Cut to the next morning. The police arrive. They don't find Ethan anywhere. They only find his camera, dropped right outside the rusted gates of the property. The 22-year-old vanished entirely, leaving behind the very tool he brought to document his so-called rationality. The camera remains on the outside, but the truth stays locked securely inside. But here is the absolute kicker, the true horror of the situation. It's the permanent, cyclical nature of the house's curse. The source text concludes by stating that according to local legend, the blank space on that cursed photograph inside the dusty room has been filled. It now contains exactly one more face, Ethan's. The cycle is complete. The investigator has literally become the evidence. The house essentially hits the reset button, just waiting for the next person to come along and ignore a 50-year warning. Which leaves us right back where we started, doesn't it? But with a much, much heavier context. If a warning has stood for 50 years, what on earth makes us believe we are the exception? This text perfectly illustrates the fatal flaw of human curiosity. We are constantly seeking to uncover the unknown, often totally forgetting that some boundaries were drawn strictly for our own protection. It leaves you with this lingering, heavy sense of atmospheric dread. The House of No Return still stands, and it's waiting. So, tell me, the next time you see a rusted gate and hear a local rumor, will you be the one to walk away, or will you just have to see it for yourself? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this deep dive